series. So, yeah, we're in the middle of the Psalms. Actually, we're in the end of the Psalms because this is the last week we will be in this series. Next week we start in the book of James, which is going to be super cool. So yeah, I thought, this is the last Psalms, and we all love the Psalms so much, so why don't we just do 2 of them? And some of you are like, oh great, that's going to take a long time. We'll find out. I don't know. Yeah, so we're going to look at Psalms 50 and 51. And I think these Psalms are super important. I think they, one, show us, they have the ability to correct our view of God. And then also to show us a proper way to respond to Him when we see God in all of His power. So I'm going to start out, I'm going to ask, how many of you have ever been in a courtroom before? I won't ask why you were in a courtroom. I've been in 2 courtrooms, and both of them are traffic tickets. Like, everyone speeds, but only the unlucky ones get caught. And the last time I was in court was actually here in Portville. And I don't remember the judge, but he was pretty cool. But what is the tone, for those of you who've been in a courtroom, what's the general tone of the people sitting there? Like, what do you think is going to be? What?
Elated.
Elated? Oh, I thought you said sedated, but that would be
Serious.
Yeah.
Principal's office.
Okay, like going to the principal's office, yeah? The last time I was there, I remember just kind of like observing the people. And like there were some people who were just nervous and they like had a hard time making eye contact with people. I'm like, how many of you ever gotten pulled over and you have that same sense of like, okay, keep your hands on the steering wheel, use like my manners, thank you for the food. Wait, no, that's not it. Like when we're in the midst of someone who suddenly has the ability to make our lives more difficult, we are a little zen, or like be calm, don't make any, don't say something stupid. That's usually what I'm thinking. That's what I'm thinking right now, actually. But yeah, well, we're going to look at Psalms 50, and it's like this courtroom scene. And I'm just going to start reading, and as I read, I'm going to try to glean some stuff for us. What is in this psalm for us? So, we're going to only get one verse in before I start saying stuff. But right at the beginning, a psalm of Asaph. We remember who Asaph was. It says, "The mighty one, the God, the Lord, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to where it sets." Okay, so right off, I think there's something that we should observe. That in this psalm, there are 3 different titles used for God. And actually, I'm not sure why it doesn't do this on the screen, but in the NIV, you guys have the Pew Bibles in front of you. Is the Lord right here, all caps? Yeah, okay. So when that happens in the Bible, I think I've said this before, when we see that in the Old Testament, when Lord is presented to us, the name of God as capital L-O-R-D, all caps, that is referring to the personal name of God that God gave Moses. You guys remember, like, I am, he said, who do you want me to tell the Egyptians sent me? And he said, tell them I am sent you. So, reading up on this, the 3 names in Hebrew are El, Elohim, and Yahweh. And if we translated those into English, which they did, but a little bit more, it's kind of like saying the Almighty, like all-powerful, only one perfect of our adoration, and the self-existent one. So here's these 3 different names that are supposed to grab our attention and kind of change our mind from just kind of, God, I've heard of him, he did some cool stuff, to, oh, I need to take this guy seriously. These titles are important because they draw our mind into a specific view of God, and they force us to see him in his authority. Like the judge who can make our life difficult, This is how we see God. And then he goes on to paint more of this picture, this courtroom. Verse 2, from Zion, perfect in beauty, God shines forth. Our God comes and will not be silent. A fire devours before him, and around him a tempest rages. He summons the heavens above and the earth that he may judge his people. Gather to me this consecrated people who have made a covenant with me by sacrifice, and the heavens proclaim his righteousness, for he is a God of justice. Okay, so if the three names didn't do it for us, I think there's a description in verse 3 that should kind of make us kind of step back a little bit. And if we're in this courtroom and God makes his way in, he doesn't do it daintily. This is a big deal, and I think the Israelites who would be reading this would recognize some of these descriptions from some of their history that they would know. Specifically, verse 3, our God comes and will not be silent. A fire devours before him, and around him a tempest rages. I think if we're going back in the Old Testament, if we look at Exodus and see how God came down to be with his people and give them this covenant that he just talked about in these verses, he came down and it describes like this fire and this tempest and this crazy situation happening on top of Mount Sinai, where he was meeting with Moses to give his people the law. Okay? And Moses tells his people, hey, it's going to be scary. Don't come up on the hill. God is holy, and this hill is set apart. Don't come up yet. And then later it says they saw all of this going on, this fire on the mountain, this thunder, and like they were scared. And not only did they not go close to the mountain, but where they were standing from, they actually stepped back. Okay? And I think this description of God isn't just to like take him seriously, but to recognize him in all of his power and authority. He is a God of righteousness and justice. And when he stands up to give a charge against someone, we're supposed to take note. Not just take note, but, I don't know, sit in our seats. I think sometimes we don't fear, people say we don't want to fear God. We have Jesus who comes close to us. But when we see God in all of his power and his authority, I think our reaction is going to be to step back. Which is amazing that the same God that we want to step back from in his power and his authority is a God who says, come close. Let's read on. Because I think we want to figure out, okay, what's this charge that God has against his people? Mind you, if you look, it says, he summons the heavens above and the earth. So he's got his two witnesses. They're standing around and watching this judgment take place. And who is he judging? His own people, okay? His chosen people. So for us, while we're not Israelites, okay, we are God's people. And I think we should take note about what this judgment has to do with it. Because specifically, it has to do with the way they view God and the way that they worship him. And we do both of those things, right? We want to view God correctly, and we want to worship him. So, he says in verse 7, listen, my people, and I will speak. I will testify you, Israel, I am God, your God. He's making it personal. I bring no charge against you concerning your sacrifices or concerning your burnt offerings, which are ever before me. I have no need of a bull from your stall or a goat from your pens. For every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains, and the insects in the fields are mine. If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you, for the world is mine and all that is in it. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink blood of goats? was wrong with their worship? I mean, you read this and you're like, well, they're doing everything. I mean, I'm not expecting everyone to go back to Leviticus and read the whole law and like, oh, they did that, check that, check that. But God gave them the sacrificial system, and they were doing it. They were taking their sacrifice, their payment for their own sins, to the temple. And God says, I don't take issue with that. But we can gather from these verses that something was wrong with the way they viewed God. So, I'm going to tell you track one. I don't know if this is time for it yet, but track one is they didn't take God seriously. There is a quote I'd like to read you guys, which I think this guy sums it up really well. Okay, it's by John Stott. He was a theologian, wrote stuff. It is absurd to suppose that he who sustains life should himself need to be sustained. That he who supplies our needs should himself need our supply. Any attempt to tame or domesticate God, to reduce him to the level of a household pet, dependent on us for food and shelter, is again a ridiculous reversal of roles. We depend on God. He does not depend on us. See, this leads me to a question. Why do we offer God anything at all? What was the purpose of an offering? What's the purpose of worship? What does God gain from that? Anything we can give or do for God, he can better provide and do for himself. See, Israel had confused their view of God with how the surrounding culture had viewed their idols. You know, like vending machine God, I give this, I do this, I pay attention to these things, and you have to respond and do what I want in response. But God cannot be obligated. The whole sacrificial system, the agreement that God made with Israel, was a mercy and a grace to Israel, that they might live with him in his presence, and he would be their God. I think when we read these verses, it's easy to be like, wow, God is really upset with these guys. We go on and we read later in the chapter some of the things he says to them, and it's like, wow, God is kind of harsh. But when I read these things, I think God is heartbroken for his people. Because all throughout their history, he has been faithful and he has been providing for them. And they think that they can just drop their sheep off at the temple and say, see you later. I did my bit. And somehow God is going to be, oh, okay, thanks for spending time with me via your calf. I mean, I think God is brokenhearted that these people are completely missing it, completely missing him. And he prescribes a solution. In verse 14, he says, sacrifice thank offerings to God. Fulfill your vows to the Most High. And call on me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you will honor me. That phrase, thank offerings. I had to look that up because it's easy to be like, oh, that's just like, be thankful to God. But in the Old Testament, in the Leviticus 14, chapter 14, if you want to write that down and go see what I'm talking about. Chapter 14, thank offering was a specific type of offering the Israelites could bring to God. And it wasn't mandatory. It was completely voluntary. And it was made up of like 3 different types of grain mixed with oil. And they would take it to the priest, and people would share it together. And it was like this sacrifice that was supposed to basically fix your mindset that, hey, I'm dependent on God. Everything that I have, he has provided. And I'm giving this sacrifice, whether I can afford it or not, knowing that he is the one who is going to provide in the future. It requires a humble heart. And it really did create thankfulness in the giver. And what did they have to be thankful for? I mean, what did the Israelites have to be thankful for? What was the point of giving a thanks offering? I don't know, 100 years of provision, protection, and guidance. He rescued them from slavery. He sustained them all throughout the desert when they were wandering because of their own sin, going above and beyond. He fought for them. He got rid of these corrupt and evil cultures in the land that would have come back and probably destroyed Israel. And because of their own failures, some of them did still do that. He provided their physical and their spiritual needs by giving them a sacrificial system that said, yeah, you messed up, but I am able to provide and make this right. And what's Israel doing? Well, here's my sheep. See ya. I think God is brokenhearted. And then he draws attention to another group of people, or possibly the same group of people, in verse 16. But to the wicked person, God says, what right have you to recite my law or take my covenant on your lips? You hate my instruction and cast my word behind you. When you see a thief, you join with him, and you throw in your lot with adulterers. You use your mouth for evil and harness your tongue to deceit. You sit and testify against your brother and slander your own mother's son. When you did these things and I kept silent, you thought I was exactly like you. But now I arraign you and set my accusation before you. Here we see that they weren't just half-hearted. They didn't just misview God, but they were hypocrites. I think the same language used here should remind us of how Jesus spoke to the Pharisees a couple times. He called them whitewashed tombs. You know what to say. You know about God. But when it comes to actually living like you know God, or, knowing God when you're living, you are hypocrites. God wanted personal engagement. He didn't want people to just bring stuff and, half-hearted. He didn't want people to just know stuff about him, which these people did. He says, what right do you have to recite my law on your lips? It means nothing to you. I think we could probably take some of these words to heart and examine our own worship. Not just like here on a Sunday, but like in our lives. Ask ourselves, what does God really get from my worship? What is the point of me offering anything to him? And here's the thing. If he doesn't get your heart, if you don't offer your heart, whatever you give him isn't worth it. That's not what he wants. And then he goes on to say in verse 22, consider this, you who forget God, or I will tear you to pieces with no one to rescue you. Those who sacrifice thank offerings honor me, and to the blameless I will show my salvation. God, we don't say things like that. Tear you to pieces. It's 2018, and you're just supposed to be loving and affirming and make me feel better about my stupid decisions. At first glance, we aren't sure what to do with these verses, right? Because Jesus didn't speak like that. He didn't speak like that to everybody. If the beginning of the chapter made us take God seriously, I think the end of the chapter also should make us take God seriously and tell us that God takes this seriously. And on top of that, I think, at least for me, anytime I'm reading, especially the Old Testament, and I think, man, God is really harsh, or that's just like one step too far, God, as if I could say something like that. I need to remember the cross.
Amen.
And isn't that the consequence of our sin already? Separation from God? It only leads to destruction. Maybe not here, but eventually it will lead to destruction for eternity. And even in such a harsh manner, what is God saying? What is God hoping his people will do? He wants them to turn back to him. He's pleading for their hearts. I don't want your stuff or your knowledge or all that stuff. I want your heart right here next to me. So personal. I think if Psalms 50 is trying to bring our hearts back into alignment with God by giving us an accurate view of him and an accurate view of ourselves, how bad our sin is, how easily distracted we are. I mean, he's still talking to his people the whole time, right? At the beginning of the chapter, he says, "You are my people, I am your God." So, throughout this whole thing, he's not saying, "I'm done with you, you're not my people anymore." There is still confidence, we can still have confidence that they are his people. The rest of the Bible will tell us that. So 51, or 50 is trying to help us, show us, hey, this is what God is like, this is what we are like. I think chapter 51 is an appropriate response of the believer, of the Christian, when we realize, wow, my heart is messed up, and my view of God is off right now, and I need to bring it back into alignment. See, 51 has a pretty well-known history. Right at the beginning of the chapter it says, "To the choir master, a psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet went to him about that whole ordeal with the adultery, the murder." If you don't know that story, I should have written where it's in 2 Samuel 11. Oh, look at that. 2 Samuel 11. If you want to go back and read this account, it is one of the lowest of lows of David's life. And his sin had some pretty significant consequences, not just for him, but to the entire nation of Israel, his family. And there's this interesting thing right at the beginning. Nathan comes to him and he lures him into basically confessing his sin. And David admits that he's done something wrong. He admits to all of it. And Nathan says something like, "God has passed over your sin." Okay? So he has that assurance from this man of God, directly from God. God has passed over your sin. And yet he still goes and he writes Psalm 51. It is a psalm of public declaration for mercy from God. And I think we need to remember what the Psalms are for, because they are also for us. It's easy to be like, wow, that history, David was really messed up, and this psalm, he should have written that. But the Psalms were meant for us. They're a book for God's people, for the church, that we are supposed to read together, to worship God through, and to align our hearts with him better. So when we read this, don't just have the historical context in mind, which is important, but this is also a psalm that I can read and desperately it would reflect my heart. So let's start with verse 1. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know I have transgressed, and my sin is always before me." That line. How many of you have ever done something stupid, said something you shouldn't have, and the rest of the day it just keeps going on replay in your mind? Yeah. This is what he's saying. I know I've sinned because I'm reminding myself of it constantly. I can't get it out of my mind. "Against you and you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. So you are right in your verdict and justified when you judge." I want to hang out on the idea of mercy for a little bit. Because, I don't know about you guys, but I'm really good about asking God for forgiveness, right? I mean, I can ask people for forgiveness. I feel like I'm always saying sorry to someone. And you know what? When you ask forgiveness or when you say you're sorry, you don't even have to be sorry. Like you can say, please forgive me to someone who you don't even agree with their offense towards you. Please forgive me. You're being ridiculous, but please forgive me, okay? But mercy is different than forgiveness because when we ask for mercy, it requires us to view the offense the same way the person who we're asking it from views it. And we're recognizing that they have the authority to make our life difficult. They have the authority to not give us mercy. Mercy is not getting what you do deserve, right? You do something you shouldn't do, someone doesn't punish you, that is mercy, because you didn't get what you do deserve. As opposed to grace, which is getting something you have no right to and no, you don't deserve. Mercy is entirely the prerogative of the one who gives it, and someone who asks for it must recognize the authority of the giver and the gravity of their own wrongdoing. And David is absolutely distraught over his sin. He can't get it out of his mind. And he's already been told God has passed over his sin. He doesn't count it against him anymore. And why is he still asking for mercy? I think it's because he recognizes the authority of God, and he recognizes that he really messed up. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Yet you desire faithfulness even in the womb. You taught me wisdom in the secret place. Cleanse me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out my iniquity. Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence, or take away your Holy Spirit from me. Restore me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. I think if you just spend time poring over this psalm, you see that there is this desperation in David. A dirty cloth cannot clean itself. It can scrub and scrub, but it's just going to move the dirt around. And he's not just asking to be clean, right? He's asking for a guiltless heart. He's asking for a pure heart. He's asking for God, who created all things, to again do his creative work and create a new heart in him, because the one he has is dirty. He cannot undo what he has done, which, by the way, was rape, murder. He lied about it. He lied to a lot of people. I mean, these things are in our own culture. You look at some of those things he's done. We are not a very forgiving culture when it comes to rape. We should be crying out to God, right? Our own justice says that. Like, yeah, punish him. But more than that, he pleads with God to restore him the joy of his salvation. So track 1 was, on side B, was remember your need for God's mercy. And track 2 would be remember the joy of your salvation. I think that's why he was in this situation to begin with. I think that's why Israel was in the situation in chapter 50. Right? They forgot the joy of their salvation. They forgot what God had saved them from. The moment we take lightly or belittle the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, the moment we forget what God no longer holds against us, the moment that we forget that it was freely offered to us without me even. God, it tells us that He died for us before we even had a chance to acknowledge Him. He was ready to forgive us. The moment we forget our salvation and how far it reaches into our past and our future, the moment we are no better than David here in this verse, and no better than the Israelites in chapter 50, who had forgotten that God didn't just want our stuff. He didn't just want us to, drop by for, hey, thanks for my salvation, see you later. He wanted a personal relationship. That's what He bought on the cross. And if that makes you a little uncomfortable, you're not alone. Because I think if we all did a little introspection, we're probably there every day, forgetting the joy of our salvation. I know I am. I need Psalm 51 every day, because I need God's mercy every day. And I remember who He is and what He has saved me from. I remember the cross. I think, while I was preparing for this, there were a couple of theologians who argued Christians don't have to beg for God's mercy or ask for God's mercy anymore. We have the cross. And while I agree we don't have to beg for mercy, I think when the cross is our confidence that when we ask for mercy, God gives it to us through His Son, Jesus Christ. So when we remember the joy of our salvation, it's a tool to help us bring our hearts back into alignment with Him. Our God is so willing to show us mercy, not just give us what we deserve, because here He has taken what we deserve and given it to Jesus. That's the joy of our salvation. He is faithful to us even when we are faithless to Him. That's the joy of our salvation. God looks at us and sees the purity, righteousness, and the love of Jesus, not whatever thing we just looked at online or whatever person we just had contempt for because they cut in front of me, or all of the things that we do throughout our day that just pull our hearts away from God. When God looks at us, He sees Jesus. And that's the joy of our salvation. When we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us, like David asked, from all unrighteousness. That's the joy of our salvation. And I think this is awesome, because in verse 13, He's asking him to redeem, to remember the redemption he had. And then he goes on and he talks about, don't just redeem my past, redeem my future, which I think this is an awesome verse for people. People hear, I hear people say all the time, like, I've just done too much. God can't forgive me. God can't use me. I walk into that building and the roof is going to collapse because I'm such a horrible sinner. This is David. Look at the sin in his life. And he says in verse 13, after he pleads for this mercy from God, then I will teach transgressors your way, so that sinners will turn back to you. Deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed, O God. You who are God, my Savior, and my tongue will sing of your righteousness. Open my lips, Lord, and my mouth will declare your praise. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, and a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. He's not just asking God to redeem his past. He's saying, Lord, show me mercy and you can redeem my future. Someone who remembers the joy of their salvation. I mean, we see this with people who are newly converted. I hate that word, but who newly discover the love of Jesus, the personal love of Jesus for them. There is this joy of their salvation that is just evident. And then a couple of days, a couple of years, a couple lifetimes go by, and we lose that joy because we don't remember to seek it every day, to seek God's mercy every day. I love this because David recognizes that he's done some horrible things. He's crying out to God for mercy. And he recognizes that God can not just redeem his heart, redeem his family, redeem his horrible situation, but that God can redeem his future, his past story, and he can use it for his own glory. There's no life story that God cannot redeem. And there's no person here or out there that can use up God's mercy. I love this. At camp this year, I had the opportunity to speak through the book of Jonah with the different camps. And there's that verse that Petey talked about a couple weeks ago, where Jonah is complaining to God, and he's saying, I knew that you were like this. I knew that you were full of grace and mercy, and you were just ready at the drop of a hat to forgive these people of their sins and turn your plans of destruction into plans of forgiveness. So I turned around and I asked the kids, like, what does that mean? Like, God is full of grace and mercy and love. What is that? And this little girl spoke up and she's like, he's got so much grace, mercy, and love that he could never spend it all. And I think that's so true. Sometimes we can't sit in our sin and forget to cry out to the one who is so ready at the drop of a hat to bring us back to him, to be close to our hearts. But the thing is, I won't ask for mercy unless I realize that I need it. And there are at least 3 reasons that I can think of that we need God's mercy. I still sin daily. God is still almighty and all authoritative. And the cross gives me confidence that when I ask, I will receive it. So, on your sheets there, you have some prompts. And I really like prompts. I use them throughout my day to just kind of bring my wandering heart, to ask it some good questions and draw closer to God. And we're going to do something we don't usually do, which I guess, like hundreds and hundreds of years ago, the church used to do something like this, where they would stand together and they would sing a song or recite a prayer of kind of public confession, asking God together to give us mercy. So we're going to sing a song that we haven't sung before, and if it's uncomfortable or if you don't feel like you know the words well enough to sing it out, we can use these prompts. Think to God. Ask him, what have you saved me from? What have you saved me from today? And then also, what is the joy of your salvation? Which goes back to, what has God saved you from? What reason do you have to be over the top joyful, which in a couple minutes we're going to have opportunity to worship more just beyond this song. And we can use that time to also remember the joy of our salvation. It's one thing I love about some of the songs we do. They just make me want to explode, even though some of the slow ones, I know. I like the slow songs. But the joy of our salvation, there are more reasons than I can sit here and come up with to be thankful and joyful, and recognizing what God has given.